From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The U.S. and NATO allies consider sending tanks to help Ukraine break Russian positions. But what accounts for Germany's reluctance? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Joe Sternberg in London and Kim Strassel here back in the USA. Last week, the U.S. announced another $2.5 billion in aid to Ukraine. And on Friday, representatives of 50 governments met in Germany at Ramstein Air Base. And the negotiation there, part of it seemed to be whether the U.S. and other allies would send tanks to Ukraine. And the Germans had so far refused to send their Leopard 2 tanks. But it seems, Joe, that other countries are getting closer to maybe doing it on their own. And it could be a coalition of the willing, not everyone in NATO, but countries that are willing to step up and do that. It seems like they might go forward.
Yes, I mean, the big story here is why on earth Berlin is dragging its feet sending these Leopards. I mean, certainly Germany has had to cope with a bunch of policy neuroses during this Ukraine war to do with their weapons deliveries. I mean, first their red line was that they didn't want to send any weapons at all. And fortunately, they got over that last year, and then they even started sending some of the Cheetah tanks, which are useful for anti-aircraft operations. But now the big story is these Leopards, which are a much more intensive form of combat tank, which I think are potentially very important to the Ukrainians as we start looking ahead to the spring fighting season. And the important fact here is partly that Germany has a lot of these Leopard tanks that they could be sending, but so far don't want to, but also that a lot of Germany's allies within NATO also have bought these tanks from Germany over the years and would like to be able to send them to Ukraine, but require Germany's position and permission in order to re-export them. And so I think this is becoming a real problem the longer Berlin drags its feet in terms of its own willingness to provide this aid. I mean, the big story of the past week is this growing exasperation on the part of the US and a lot of other NATO allies with Berlin's apparent resistance to playing ball here.
And one of the things the reporting has suggested is that Germany wants the U.S. to be part of any tank deliveries, that before it would give approval for the Leopard tanks to go over, it wants to see American Abrams M1 tanks. And some people in Washington seem like they are willing to do that. Let's listen to Senator Chris Coons on ABC Sunday.
I am concerned that Russia is rearming and preparing for a spring offensive. If it requires our sending some Abrams tanks in order to unlock getting the Leopard tanks from Germany, from Poland, from other allies, I would support that. I respect that our military leaders think the Abrams is too sophisticated, too expensive a platform to be as useful as the Leopards, but we need to continue to work with our close allies and to move forward in lockstep.
Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal is reporting this morning, here's the top of the news story, the Biden administration is leaning toward sending a significant number of Abrams M1 tanks to Ukraine, and an announcement of the deliveries could come this week, U.S. officials said. It would be part of a broader diplomatic understanding with Germany in which Berlin would agree to send a smaller number of its own Leopard 2 tanks and would also approve the delivery of more of the German-made tanks by Poland and other nations. Kim, I wonder what you make of this. And the Biden administration had been hesitating to send the Abrams tank to Ukraine, and now it seems like they may move forward on that.
Hesitating as usual, yes. When it comes to some of this more sophisticated equipment, this has been one of the problems with the Biden administration. I give it credit for keeping coalitions together, for generally remaining strong on the issue of Ukraine and spending more money and other munitions. But when it's come to certain aircraft or this question of the tank, the argument against sending the Abrams is that they're too complicated for the Ukrainians to operate. They take too much training, too much logistical support. They're too gas guzzly. They've had all of these arguments. But what seems to be growing apparent is that the White House looks to understand that it needs to break what has become a logjam now with Germany's reticence to do anything here. And Germany has suggested that it is worried that Russia will escalate. It doesn't want to be seen to be out there on its own making this decision to greenlight tanks. And so it wants some cover, as it were. And the United States apparently is now leaning toward doing that. And it's so important because we are headed out of what has become a winter deadlock. Both sides are gearing up for what could be a very vicious spring offensive. And Ukraine really needs to be prepared for that. And in order to break through Russian lines, it needs a lot of these tanks. And, Poland has talked about sending a company of them, which is about 14 tanks. But Prime Minister Vladimir Zelensky's chief of staff in Ukraine has said that the country needs several hundred. Now, if you can break this logjam, it's possible you could get closer to those numbers because the Leopard 2s are owned and operated by some 20 countries, ranging from Canada all the way to Turkey. So there's a lot of countries in that coalition that would like to help Ukraine. And if you can get this off the ground, you could see a huge outpouring of these tanks into Ukraine. And that seems to be the operating thinking in the White House, is that maybe this is just what needs to be done in order to get everything moving.
But I'm not sure I understand the hesitation around tanks specifically. I mean, there are a few issues that have been raised as American equipment has been sent to Ukraine. One of them is whether it's escalatory. The Biden administration has hesitated on sending long-range missiles, for example, on the theory that the Ukrainians could shoot them into Russian territory, which would be escalatory. I don't see how that applies to battle tanks. There have been questions with some of this equipment about whether American stocks contain enough of this equipment that we would have enough for ourselves if we got into a situation where someone was being attacked. Again, I don't know how that applies to tanks. There's some reporting that NATO militaries have something like 2,000 Leopard tanks, and meanwhile, the U.S. Marine Corps is currently retiring its tanks as it shifts toward a strategy of island warfare in the Pacific. And then Kim raises the question about maintenance and training. So the journal story says the Pentagon previously had ruled out providing the tanks to Ukraine, saying they were too complicated for the Ukrainians to maintain and operate. And yet, Joe, I would point out that that is the same sort of things that the Biden administration was saying months ago about the Patriot missile system. There's a briefing in November where there's a general saying that it's significant maintenance issues, training on those things. None of these systems are plug and play. You can't just show up on the battlefield and start using them. On the other hand, now we have transferred or are in the process of transferring a Patriot missile system to the Ukrainians. And here's the top of a CBS news story last week. Ukrainians began training Tuesday morning in Oklahoma at Fort Sill to operate and maintain the Patriot missile defense system. A Pentagon official confirmed Tuesday morning. This involves about 90 to 100 Ukrainian troops. And so, Joe, I understand that these are not simple systems and there are maintenance and training issues, but the sooner you get started working on those, the sooner you can get this stuff on the ground where it can make a difference.
Okay, so I so rarely say complimentary or even sympathetic things about the Biden administration. It might be kind of a surprise that I'm going to do that here. But I mean, I think the key perspective here is that this argument about the Abrams tanks is kind of a sideshow. The issue is the Leopards in Europe and Germany's refusal to do that. And the only reason that we are having this argument about sending the Abrams tanks is because German Chancellor Olaf Scholz seems to have suggested that that might be the thing that would make him comfortable sending the German Leopards. But I mean, that's kind of a nonsense argument that the Germans are making here. I mean, they claim that they have a case of the vapors over whether sending the Leopards would be escalatory and might prompt some kind of retaliation, even nuclear retaliation from Putin. I mean, this is a common line that you hear there. They talk about how they don't want to go it alone on sending the Leopard tanks, except that they wouldn't be, because they would clearly be doing this in concert with a lot of their NATO allies like Poland, who are much more eager than the Germans are, to send the tanks. No one is going to accuse the Germans of an excess of enthusiasm for having armed Ukrainians here. So I think that this really is ultimately a European story. And I think that if sending the Abrams ends up being the thing that Biden has to do in order to unstick this logjam that has developed in Germany over the tank issue, then that's what we need to do, I guess. But it is kind of an embarrassment for Germany and America's European allies that we find ourselves in this position, because there is no reason that the shipment of these Leopard tanks had to depend on America providing the Abrams. And in fact, I think that all of this toing and froing that we've had over recent weeks is only contributing to delays that are not going to serve the Ukrainians well and is not going to serve the interests of European security well.